All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to raise the awareness of trauma and to support and inspire new trauma therapists just starting out on the trauma-informed journey. I do that with my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0, my online courses and workshops, and the Trauma Therapist newsletter. If you're a therapist of any kind and you work with individuals who've been impacted by trauma, I invite you to head on over to my website at thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. All right, let's get started. All right, Laura, are you ready to do this?
Yes, I am.
All right, here we go. Let me just make sure we're recording. Yes, we are. All right, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I am very excited to have as my guest today, Dr. Laura Anderson. Laura, are you ready?
I'm ready. Let's do it.
All right. So Dr. Laura is a licensed marriage and family therapist in the state of Tennessee, professor of psychology, and an approved supervisor. She has a Master of Arts in Marriage and Family Therapy and recently completed her PhD in mind-body medicine at Saybrook University. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
In 2019, Dr. Laura co-founded the Religious Trauma Institute with the hope of educating clinicians, coaches, and other healers, as well as advocating for victims of religious trauma. In 2021, she co-founded the Trauma Resolution Coach Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery. I think I mixed that up, but we'll get that later. Laura, welcome.
Well, thank you so much.
So you're a go-getter.
You know, I guess, yeah.
Of course you are. Look, before we dive in, share with the listeners where you're from and where you're calling from. Where you're from originally, that is.
Yes. So I'm originally from Minnesota, northern Minnesota to be exact. And I lived there the first 28 years of my life. And then I moved to Nashville, Tennessee shortly after I got my master's degree. Just wanted a change in life and have been here for about 12 years. And it's been great. And so that's where my private practice is. Although the pandemic, whenever the pandemic started, everything went online. I went online too, and my clients requested to never not be online. So I'm still online for my private practice, and of course, with my coaching company. Yeah.
Awesome. All right, so let's just dive into this. Yeah. How the heck did you get into this field?
That's a great question, and actually goes along with my passion of working with religious trauma. Whenever I grew up, I believed as a woman, I had one purpose in life, and that was to get married and have children and, be involved in church things and all of that. And somewhere in there, that didn't sit totally right with me. I knew there was maybe bigger things out there for me, and slowly started pursuing education and worked actually at a church. And when that was coming to a close, I thought, my degree is in ministry. I don't think that there's going to be many opportunities for me. I've really always loved therapy. I've always gotten feedback from people that they feel safe with me and comfortable. And so I thought, well, I'll go back to school and I'll get my master's degree, which I did. And that was also kind of what opened up some doors to be able to leave the community that I had been a part of, which was a high demand, high control religious community. And so, knowing that I could get a job virtually anywhere now, allowed me to both move from Minnesota to Nashville, as well as really starting to dig into just different areas that I was passionate about in terms of client work. So I've been in private practice, like I said, for 12 years, and it's kind of morphed. When you start off as a therapist, I was kind of a generalist. Anybody who wanted to come, I would take you. But I started figuring out kind of by happenstance, just these different areas that I was really passionate about, which is kind of the short story, the long story made short of how I got to where I am today, over a decade later. But yeah, it was really just needing a new career and figuring out what am I passionate about? And it's people. I say I've been in the people business for over 2 decades now, in various forms, but I've always been somebody who's been really passionate about other people and healing, and how I can be a support to them. You
said you left that community, which was high demand, high control, and the way that fell off your tongue was very interesting to me. And what does that mean?
Yeah. So it's a term that myself and other professionals have started to adopt. When we think of religion in psychological terms, it's typically been considered a pro-social factor, a supportive factor in people's lives, and surely that is the case for many people. But as we've started doing research, and as people have been free to share their stories, as certain things have happened in our country, there's been this recognition that there's been these dynamics of power and control, spiritual abuse, things that are happening in some of these religions. And we kind of use the term high demand, high control, because when you look at some of these religious groups, whether it's a specific denomination of churches or a single church by himself, maybe a family church, what might be considered more of a cult-like religion, they kind of have these dynamics of power and control that are not dissimilar from like a domestically violent relationship or a domestically violent system. And so it kind of gives us almost like an umbrella term to use rather than saying, oh, it's this religion, this church, and people might throw out terms and you're not quite sure, well, what does that actually mean? Fundamentalist or evangelical or, different denominations. And so this is kind of a way when we say high demand, there's a lot of things that are demanded of you and a lot of control that either church leadership, authority, or maybe even your higher power has over your life to dictate kind of what goes on and what's okay, what's not okay, punishment, consequence, relationships. So it's kind of an umbrella term that myself and other professionals are moving towards, to just be able to give a term for people to use of like, these are kind of the overarching dynamics of what happens in some of these groups.
Good. I appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah.
We'll come back to that, but
Sure.
So you got your MA,
Mm-hmm.
you realized you love people.
Yes.
Now, how did you start learning about trauma?
Yeah, that's a great question. And honestly, it's my own story. I had a lot of things happen and wasn't quite sure how to categorize them. I knew things were happening in my body. I knew there was a lot of symptoms. I would go to doctors and it's like they had that, cloud above their head with a giant question mark in it as I would describe certain things. And I was open about, here's what my experiences have been, and here's what my body symptoms are. And nobody ever kind of put those together. And so I really just started digging. I had to advocate for myself. At that time, even trauma in the therapy world wasn't understood even 5 or 10 years ago, the way that we understand it today. I think about like Peter Levine's book, In an Unspoken Voice, came out in 2012. I had it sitting on my shelf and I still was like, I don't know what is going on. And like, I didn't even, I didn't consider reading it. And so my kind of deep dive into trauma happened really as a result of my own story and my own drive to heal things in my own body, in my own life, in my relationships. But as that happened, simultaneously, I'm seeing people come into my office without even advertising, this is something I'm learning about or passionate about. And they're coming in with some of the same stories. And of course, I live in Nashville. That is the Bible Belt, in the southern United States. And so, when I moved here, no joke, people would say, "Oh, what's your name and what church do you go to?" That's how it goes. And so there's a lot of expectations. And I noticed people coming into my office and they're saying, I still believe in my higher power, but I'm really struggling here, and here. I'm dealing with massive anxiety and panic. I'm dealing with these physiological symptoms. And I started to be able to then put a framework behind it and understand how that was living in the body. And so I think as I healed more, I felt more confident then to be able to say with my clients, like, let's go into this. I started getting various trauma training certificates and education. And it kind of was just like this thing that morphed and truly, where I really started to become open in terms of like, this is something that I have, probably 75% of my clientele is religious trauma survivors, was in 2019. I was almost 3/4 of the way through my PhD program. I had so many clients on my waiting list that were trying to get in with me. And I thought, I don't have the bandwidth to do this. I need other practitioners and clinicians to know about this, to be trained in this, to understand that religious trauma lives in your body the same way that any other trauma does, and we resolve it in our bodies the same way you would sexualized trauma or developmental trauma and these sorts of things. And so I thought, well, I will put together a manual for that, just the things that I've learned, how trauma lives in the body, some of the things that we're seeing in high demand, high control religions, and hopefully clinicians will pick up on it and be able to help their clients with more meaningful practices and effectiveness. And that is where I met online. I put a call out on Twitter. I said, hey, if this is you, what would you want your therapist to know? And I thought I would get, 10, 15 responses, and I got hundreds of responses. And I was blown away because I was like a newbie at social media. But that is where some guy commented, and I clicked on his profile, and he said religious trauma therapist in Boise, Idaho. And I thought, I need to know this person. And so that is the co-founder of the Religious Trauma Institute, Brian Peck. That's how we met, and we kind of dove into the religious trauma world together.
Okay, wait, hold on.
Yes.
This is great. It's amazing. It's great. I want to get there, but I want to go back. You said something that I want to put a little magnifying glass around if we can. And that was, you talked about your own healing process. You said things were happening to you, things were happening in your body that you couldn't put together. Share a little bit about what that was.
Yeah, just what was happening inside me. Yeah.
For you.
For me, I noticed I was in an abusive romantic partnership. And once I got out of that is when I started to really notice things that were happening, a huge increase of anxiety and depression, a lot of social fears. I wasn't agoraphobic, but I don't know that I was that far away from it either, kind of heading in that path, a lot of social anxiety, a lot of physiological symptoms in terms of chronic pain, gastrointestinal issues. I remember one day I looked at a list of symptoms for hypothyroidism, and I checked every single one of the boxes. But when I went to the doctor, my blood work was perfect. And it was one of those weird things where he looked at me and he was like, you're right, you have all the symptoms, but your blood work isn't matching up here. There was a lot of relational issues that I had, high anxiety in relationships, just unable to be able to communicate, set boundaries, those sorts of things. I really isolated myself out of fear and need for safety. I had my world became very, very tiny. I had 3 people that I trusted for a couple of years where I thought I can be in public with you for a limited amount of time because you feel safe. But outside of that, I'm constantly hypervigilant, constantly activated. And now, looking back, and I can look at different articles and research and whatever about PTSD and CPTSD, and I'm like, oh, I mean, I fit that profile so completely. But like I said, trauma was so much considered an event, right? The thing that happened to you. And I was like, well, I know I was in this really bad church, religion, whatnot, but there wasn't one thing I could point back to and said, well, when that happened, everything changed, right? And so I was very confused. And so I had all these symptoms, and I started charting them. I started noting things down. And then it wasn't until years later when I was able to open up things like In an Unspoken Voice by Peter Levine, or some of these other really solid.
Before you were in school?
No, this was right after I got done with school. Yeah. Okay. And so, for any therapists out there who have gone through formal therapy, counseling, education, I think you get like one course on trauma, and it's usually paired with like trauma and crisis, And so and when they teach about trauma, it's very much in that traditional way. Trauma is an event. You use in vivo exposure, kind of those old school ways. And I was even trained in trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. And so I was like, well, I can do that on myself, and it is not working, So it was a lot of confusion, but yeah. And that's how I was able to start noticing things in my clients as well, because I knew what to look for at that point. I had lived it, and then I knew what I could look for in clients.
So there's so much to talk about here. I mean, you're so inspiring. You've got me going in all these different directions here. When you did start noticing that or sharing that with your clients, how did you introduce that in the session?
It's interesting because I know in a lot of traditional therapy programs, academic programs, we're taught, do not use self-disclosure, be very careful about that and whatnot. What I started to understand, especially with religious trauma clients, was that there was almost a necessary disclosure that was needed to help normalize some of the things that they were experiencing, and for them to go, oh my gosh, this isn't just me. I'm not the only one who has felt these ways. And so that I started to include that. Of course, I didn't go into all the nitty-gritty details, but I started to include little parts of my own story of just whether it was a simple statement of like, I want you to know I understand that on a deeply personal level. That's something I've dealt with too. Or, being able to say, hey, in my experience, when these things are happening in our bodies, that usually indicates trauma. I've experienced that as well. And sometimes it was even just simply agreeing with, they would say, oh, this artist or this book or this pastor, and I'd go, oh yeah, I listened to that person too. And I can understand why it would feel so overwhelming, even to talk about it. I'm noticing you getting really agitated. So there was an element of my own self that I had to bring into that to be able to just offer a sense of empathy, but also connection and normalizing of, hey, what you're experiencing, you're not the only one, first of all. And yeah, it is that bad, and you're not just, it wasn't just a quote unquote bad church experience. There really was abuse. There really was a lot of threat and overwhelm that you lived with consistently for years. And that's where I really started to tie together complex trauma with religious trauma. Most people were going, yeah, it wasn't the singular event that we might think of with PTSD. It was this over time, consistent, persistent fears, threats, overwhelm, and the very people they might look to for safety and connection, such as their parents, were also the people that were preaching those same overwhelming threats or giving those same overwhelming consequences. And it just lived in their bodies, like complex trauma does.
So you get to this point where you're like, or I have to, you founded the trauma religious, which is, to me, really that's what this podcast is about for me, because I love talking to people like you who are like, you have this experience and you have to do something about it. And you do. You go online, you start sending out these tweets, you meet this guy, what happens?
Yeah, we first started connecting just to talk about what's your experience, what's my experience, how do you deal with clients, these sorts of things. And we just really connected. I think we were each the first professional that the other person found that understood religious trauma as trauma. There was other people that were kind of in the field that were saying it's its own separate thing. Or if you want to heal from religious trauma, you just have to become an atheist, or you just, you have to believe that, religious trauma causes mental health illnesses. And I just wasn't buying that. I don't think that's clinically accurate. I think that's very problematic on a variety of levels. But when we started looking at religious trauma as trauma, we were like, hey, we could use things like somatic experiencing and internal family systems and all these wonderful modalities and all this amazing research. And let's use that to help train clinicians and train helpers and healers so that people have access to help that is meaningful and effective. And of course, we also want to support survivors, with groups and stuff like that. But our main goal is clinicians. And so, he was just the first person that we really connected. And we collaborated with a couple other people that lived in Minnesota. They have an organization called the Reclamation Collective. They are more on the grounds client focused. And Brian and I really felt like we want to kind of target a different group of people with services and being those who are professionals in the field. So we did a lot of collaboration with them, but it was one night we were texting and I said, Religious Trauma Institute. That's what it is, right? And he's like, yes, that's it. That's what we need to do. And so, of course, we started kind of hit the ground running with a bunch of goals. And then the pandemic hit and we had to course shift for a little bit to be able to provide some extra resources for religious trauma survivors, just, as the world was kind of in a big frenzy. And we've had a lot going on. And so now we're kind of back on our path of relaunching and making it all the courses and trainings and consultation groups and everything that we have envisioned. So it's pretty exciting. Yeah.
Where can people access the Religious Trauma Institute?
Yeah. So we are about to roll out a new version of our website, but you can go to religiostraumainstitute.com.
Okay.
We also exist on social media as Religious Trauma Institute on both Instagram and Facebook. We're not super active on Twitter. But yeah, those are the places that we're at currently. And then we, I think 2 months from now, we're doing a kind of a 3-week event where we are going to be opening it up to the community. And 1 week will be focused on mental health professionals. 1 week will be focused on community members, so advocates, clergy, people who are wanting to work with religious trauma, who don't know how to get involved. And then the other week will be survivors, just as a way to kind of have this event to connect people, to network, to provide some extra resources, have some panel discussions, breakout groups, those sorts of things. That'll happen in July. And that's kind of that will set up our consultation groups and starting to get courses out there. And hopefully one day we'll do an online summit, get some of the amazing trauma professionals that are out there to be able to speak to this topic.
So just to be clear, religious trauma is not simply sexual abuse done by the clergy to someone else.
Sure. Yeah, it could be. It could, it could be. Yeah. But I think that, one of the terms that we have coined, and it is based a little bit off of adverse childhood experiences, is adverse religious experiences. A lot of people don't necessarily identify with the term spiritual abuse, or they would think of, religious abuse as exactly what you said, clergy sexual abuse. And that obviously happens. And of course, that is devastating. What we're hoping to do with that term, adverse religious experience, first of all, is research. And that we have a collaborative research group that's already been up and running for the last couple of years that is doing research on religious trauma in particular. But it's kind of this overarching term that's describing, relational, social, psychological, financial ways that these high demand, high control religions can inflict harm upon people, can have messaging that is overwhelming to the system, have consequences that leave you in constant fear, having no autonomy, no voice, no sense of self, no return to safety, because maybe there never was safety to begin with. So like anything, we wouldn't say, clergy sexual abuse is religious trauma. We would say clergy sexual abuse could result in trauma, the same way other things could. And we also kind of hypothesize that the more adverse religious experiences you have, the likelier it is that it would result in trauma or religious trauma, while also leaving space for our own bodies, our physiology, nervous systems are unique. And so what might be incredibly overwhelming and life-threatening to one person may not be to the next, or vice versa, and could also result in trauma. So we're, I feel like we're at the ground level of research, but it is happening. And that's exciting too. Our collaborative research group has like 100 researchers in it already, and they have been putting together amazing studies that, they're working with their academic institutions and other, credentialing boards and whatnot to get funding. So I'm excited to see what's coming out. That's for sure. Yeah.
So, and then in 2021, you founded
the Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery.
I mean, incredible. So how did that come about?
Yes. So I think as many clinicians experienced over the course of the pandemic, a huge influx in clients who are wanting to receive mental health support, whether that was a therapist, a counselor, a coach, other wellness type things. And my waiting list at that time, I was becoming a little bit more known in the religious trauma world as somebody who is doing work with clients. I also consider myself to be a trauma and abuse resolution coach. So I kind of had two businesses going on under my own Laura Anderson Therapy. And my waiting list ballooned to about, 4 to 5 years long. And again, I thought this is completely unsustainable. And so I one day I was like, okay, how do I provide something, right? Like, and I thought, well, I will hire 1 or 2 contract workers and they can take over my caseload that's on the waiting list. And 1 or 2 turned into 7, turned into more. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to just make this into a fully online coaching company business. Of course, we know that therapy has some, licensing things that, that provide a lot of safety for clients. And also there's limitations in terms of who you can see. Right. And so I started looking at people who had education and trainings and certifications in various areas of trauma and mental health, that knew how to do client work and could live anywhere in the US. And that was kind of the basis. We do not practice as therapists. We want to be very ethically sound and clear about that. But we have people trained in everything from, certifications from the Embody Lab, somatic experiencing, all these amazing modalities that have certifications on their own that we can use then to be able to support clients. And so I founded that, almost a little bit over a year ago. So May 1st, 2021. And it has been incredible. I work with an amazing team of practitioners who are just so passionate about religious trauma and so passionate about helping others. And it was pretty cool when we, celebrated our 1-year anniversary. I was able to tally up all of our sessions. And in the first year, we had over 2,400 client sessions, which is like blows me away. I mean, it's just incredible. And I just get so excited to have that as a resource for people anywhere really in the world. We have people that are, in Europe and Asia and the Middle East that are able to find support for this kind of specialized area of that some people just simply don't understand, and that's okay. Right. But that was kind of the impetus for that. And so it's been a true joy. I love doing it. I love being the director of that. I love being able to support other coaches as they work with their clients. That's a joy for me.
When you first started working with trauma as a professional, I want to invite you to share kind of an early clinical error.
Yes. Yes. I was thinking about this question. I feel like there's many.
with most people, right? Probably all people.
I thought about that like on a very general sense. Like my first clinical error was just not really knowing about trauma and not really having a solid framework for it. But as I was thinking about this question, knowing it was coming, an immediate case popped into my mind. And so I think I mentioned briefly, part of my own story is domestic violence. And I still work with a lot of domestic violence clients, and there's a crossover between dynamics of power and control in that type of a relationship, and also in a high demand, high control religion. And so I was working with this couple, and there was clearly domestic violence going on. There was a lot, it was pretty bad. And I asked the wife to come in one day because I felt I have to let you know about what I see going on, right? Because I need to keep you safe. And I just didn't have the skills to understand when she was being flooded and when it was too much for her. And I just felt like my job is to tell you this so that you can get out of this relationship, not paying attention to outside context, such as she didn't have a job or finances or a means to actually be able to leave this person. And so I sat and I explained, what is it, the power and control wheel that the Duluth model came out with. And I said, here's kind of some dynamics that I'm seeing. And she just was absolutely silent and then enraged and left my office. And I got, vicious emails. How could you accuse me of this or my husband of this and all these things? And I remember feeling defensive on her behalf of thinking, I'm trying to help you here. And I can see what's going on. But I had no I sometimes I kick myself because I had no awareness around what her internal experience was. And I couldn't pick up on the cues that I now look back and I'm like, that was very clear cues of she was becoming flooded. She was very overwhelmed. I will say that the interesting part is she came back several years later and said, that actually was something I needed. Thank you. And I got the chance to apologize as well, to be able to say, I'm so sorry that I put you in that position because I didn't understand what it was like to be in your body hearing this information. So that, I mean, that one has a nice little bow on the end, but that is one that I think of like, oh, I learned a lot from that. I learned I have to be very careful. And I didn't know how to do that at the time.
I appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. People listening to this learn a lot from hearing that, you know?
Yes. Yeah. I know. I told you before we started, I've listened to many episodes of your podcast, and I will say as a clinician, I loved hearing that. I think it normalized things for me of like, okay, I'm a human, I'm going to make mistakes. Right.
Of course.
But it was so nice to hear like, oh, okay, yeah, I've done this too. Here's how I can do better in the future. That was so helpful for me. Yeah. So I love that you asked that question.
All right, Laura. So as we kind of wind down here, and again, I'll have all of your information linked up here at the show notes page, traumatherapistpodcast.com. But how about a book?
Yes. Oh, I thought about this because I mean, there's like a million that I could refer to. I will say the book that I think has helped me the most personally and informed some of the ways that I practice professionally is Healing the Fragmented Selves of the Trauma Survivor by Janina Fisher. I love the kind of the eclectic integrated approach with somatic work and parts work and mindfulness and attachment. That really spoke to me as a human. It really speaks to me as the way that I work with clients. And I found that modality in particular has been really effective with my religious trauma clients. So that's one of my favorite go-to books.
Okay, awesome. She's one of my favorite people here.
Oh, she's fabulous. Yeah.
So Dr. Laura Anderson, co-founder of the Religious Trauma Institute and the Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery. Look, you're so friggin' inspiring. I'd love to have you back.
I would love to come back
later time. And I mean, you're so articulate in what you're doing, and I really appreciate you sharing your own experience. It makes this really worthwhile, I think, for a lot of people. So thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah.
Right.
What a pleasure. Yes.
We'll be in touch.
Yes. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for listening and supporting this podcast. And if you'd like to join the hundreds of other therapists who are each month keeping up to date and informed and inspired about what's going on in the world of trauma, I'd love to invite you to head on over to the Trauma Therapist newsletter. That's the traumatherapistnewsletter.com.